The Dark Millennia by Aldiss. Against the law of transience may be set one of its ancillary laws, the law of endurance. The planet Earth plies, almost, eternally about its sun, swinging its small cone of night with it like a blue sail. For the solar system, there is only one long day, an energy bath of radiation without end. That day is the prime product of the sun. The night each planet fashions its own nights. As long as the sun burns, trailing out its marigold veins of fire across the adjacent void, life devours its uninterrupted day. Only the tiny individual lives must endure their own nights. Within the gaudy glare of the solar system, that whirlpool of heat and noise, night has little place. It must hide where it can, behind planetary bodies, inside skulls, at submarine depths. Between the last fragment of the story and this next lies a metaphorical night, a night of ignorance which intelligence has been unable to bridge. We hurry across it in silence. Through our silence drift names and mirages of civilizations known by little but their names. The Threshold Consortium, the Vehicularium, the Calibon Empire, the Solite Commonwealth. The Solites are remembered as those people who discovered the means of time travel, perhaps because their brains in that particular stage of development established a special relationship with the laws of the physical world which was forever after unattainable. Their talent died with them, never to be resurrected. According to the legends which come down to us, the Solites were extinguished by a great religious machine, culture, the Vehicularium, when a functional ultimate ruled not merely Earth or the solar system, but the entire galaxy. We can only hypothesize regarding it and how and know it to be unique. Unlike all other cultures, the Vehicularium did not die. It did not succumb to decadence from within or invasion from without. It simply disappeared one clear morning. Perhaps it withdrew its presence entirely to another galaxy with more favorable properties. When it was gone, a great and terrible vacuum existed. In that vacuum drifted some 40 million years of silence, covering its progeny with the dust and ceaseless concatenations of time. Earth turns through many nights and myriads of individual deaths. During that length of time, it all makes no difference. Life, death, and the sun. These are the constants. We call this period the Dark Millennia, and pass on, because there is no point in looking back. Nor do we find a great deal changed on Earth at the end of the Dark Millennia. The constants see to that. True, there is a new stratum of sedimentary rock. Another ice age has come and gone. Modifications to the lower jaw and the intestinal flora of humankind are barely discernible. A few modest cities huddle on some of the other solar planets. The continents have changed, and fresh sands gleam at their edges. A new animal runs on the savannas, rejoicing in its strength. And, of course, many inhabited planets are in communication with Earth as the races of the galaxy go about their transactions. Mental health ship, Cyber Queen. lay quietly against a long wharf. Alone in one of its many cabins, Davy Dale sat waiting. The buttercup in his tunic was beginning to wilt. He half smiled down at it because it seemed the one connection between him and the Begawa township he had left early that morning. He had picked it up before catching a gyro into New Union. Nothing else Davy could see, either here or in the waiting room or outside, has as much colour as his buttercup. The waiting room was all greens and greys, relieved only by the formium fittings. Outside there were only greys and blacks. As evening yawned on acres of shunting yard, on the other side of the ship, the Horby River would echo the same sober tones. Quiet, quiet for parsecs around, that treacherous quiet in which nothing stirs but the anxiety deep in the bowels. In Davy's mind, the ordinary worries of a busy man were eclipsed by larger preoccupations, which grew and grew as if nourished by the silence. He waited tensely while these preoccupations rumbled as raggedly as thunder around his head. Nothing constructive would come of them. The elephantine anxieties padded head to tail like a series of catchphrases. Parsecs, Galactic Federation, hyperspace, interpenetrators. These were the words that bothered Davy. His unquick brain turned them over time and again, as if hoping to find something relevant beneath them. Nearing 50, he had known most of the words for years. They had been just words, without any attachments to experience, dictionary words. Only in this season had they come to unsettle his old life. A silent, quick footstep passed the door. Davy was at once on his feet, a sick feeling rising with him. What conclusion had they come to here about Israel? Was he born on earth or not? Or, it was really all the same question, had he been proved sane or insane? For a minute, Davy stood trembling, then sat wearily down again as he realized the footsteps had no connection with his existence. He resumed his bored scrutiny of the marshalling yards. This kind of sight was unfamiliar to him, living as he did deep in the country. Here the imports of a great sea-fringed city were borne away into their destination. His interest generally confined to the cattle he bred. Davy would have been indifferent to the spectacle at any other time. Now it did possess a faint tinkle of interest, for he saw it through Israel's eyes, and that changed the pattern entirely. The uncountable miles of track from Israel's viewpoint belonged to a primitive transport system on a remote globe. All around this globe stretched not sky, as Davy had once idly thought, but the great complicated highway called space. Not a simple nothingness, rather, Israel explained, an unfathomable interplay of forces, fields, and planes. Israel had laughed to hear that Earth word space. He had called it not space, but a maze of stresses. But of course Israel might well be crazy. Certainly nobody in Megara had ever talked as he did. And through the maze of stress fields, Israel had said, rode the interpenetrators. Davy thought of them as spaceships, but Israel called them interpenetrators. They apparently were not made of metal at all, but of mentally powered force shields, which fed on the stress fields and changed as they changed, so the people of the galaxy rode in safety between the civilized planets. At least that was what Israel claimed. And the planets warred on one another, but even the war was not as Davy understood the term. It was as stylized as chess, as formal as a handshake, as chivalrous as an ambulance, as unrelenting as a guillotine. Its objectives were more nebulous and vast than materialist earthmen could visualize, or so said Israel. But of course Israel might be mad. Even if he was, that did not affect Davy's loving admiration for him. Don't let them find him insane. Don't let them find him insane, Davy said, in an agony of repetition, speaking to the grey walls. And yet, if you proved Israel to be sane, you had to accept his mad version of reality. After all his hours of waiting, Davy was unprepared when the cabin door opened. He was standing with his fists clenched to his tunic, and dropped them in confusion as the white-haired man came in. This was Brother Joe Shansford, the psychiatrist who had interviewed Davy in the Cyber Queen, one of the roving fleet of specialist ships which had replaced the old static conception of a hospital. When Davy had first asked for help in Israel in Begara, Shansford was tall, thin, and brisk, and remarkably ugly, although age had now taken the sting out of his features, leaving them little more than notably rugged. Davy went straight over to him. "Israel?" he asked. Under that tense, eager stare, Shansford flinched. "We aren't actually certain yet," he said in his formal way. "Some of the factors involved invite very cautious evaluation indeed. It's a month since Israel came aboard here. 3 weeks since you brought him to New Union," Davy said. "I introduced him to you for his own sake, but he can't like it here, being under constant observation and everything surely all that time." "A quick decision would only be a foolish one," Shansford said. "Israel is entirely happy and safe here, and you may rest assured he is not being treated like an ordinary patient." "You told me that before." There were angry tears in Davy's eyes. He had the sensation that the whole organization of the mental health ship was rearing up against him. "In the short time since I found him, I've grown to love Israel. Surely you people here can feel his goodness of character." "His character is not in question. We are examining his mind," Shansford replied. "Excuse me if I sit down. It has been a trying day." He sat down on a hard chair and allowed his shoulders to sag slightly. Davy, old enough to understand the weariness that might lie behind that innocent-looking gesture, felt his wrath deflected, distrusting psychiatrist enough to wonder if the incident might not be a covert attempt to win sympathy. He still kept hardness in his tone as he said, "All the same, Brother Shansford, you must have felt his gentle nature. Give me a personal opinion for heaven's sake. I'm a stock breeder, not a lawyer. Israel's saner than you and I, isn't he?" "No," Shansford said slowly. "If you want a personal opinion, your protege is sinking rapidly into schizophrenic trauma. Paranoia is also present. He is, in popular usage, a hopeless case." Colour drained from under Davy's tan. He fumbled wordlessly for words among the green and grey slices of whirling room. "Let me see Israel," he finally gasped. "That will not be possible, Mr. Dial. I regret to say, the medical council have agreed that the patient will be happier in isolation, away from disturbing external influences." "But I must see him," Davy said. He could not believe what Shansford was saying for an insane moment. He thought the man must be talking about someone other than Israel. "I've got to see him. I'm his friend, Israel's friend. You can't keep him here." Shansford stood up. His face, like Davy's, was pale. He said nothing, merely waiting for Davy to finish. That was more ominous than words. "Look here," Davy said, unable to resist argument, although guessing already how useless it might be. "This tale Israel has told us about the great civilization of the galaxy, the stress fields of space, the interpenetrators, all the details of life on other planets, strange animals and flowers, you can't believe he made it all up in his head. Some of these planets he talks about, Noxy, Owlenge, you surely don't think they are just fictitious, Mr. Dial?" Shansford said in a brittle voice, "Please credit us with knowing our business here. The patient has a fertile imagination. It has finally collapsed under the stress of too much reading, omnivorous reading, I may add, which has encompassed both learned works and trash." "But his story of this galactic war," Davy protested. "Tell me," Shansford said with a dangerous calm, "do you believe a galactic war is now raging, Mr. Dial?" The engine yards outside were floating away on a tide of darkness in which isolated lights strove to act as buoys. The sky was one big cloud, cozy over New Union. Supposing I do believe, Darby thought, supposing I do believe the whole fantastic business, how can I prove I'm sane any more than easily than Israel can? How can I prove to myself I'm sane? 2 months ago, I would have laughed at this galactic rigmarole. It's just that the way Israel told it, it had a ring of truth, unmistakable, and yet, why, it is all frighteningly far-fetched, but that's why I believe it. It's too tall not to be true. I believe, so I do believe, but I'm not sure. If I were really sure, they'd lock me up too. Oh, Israel. No better place safe. After all, I'm no use to Israel, or once they have doubts about me. Before the cock crows twice. Oh, I don't know what to believe, he faltered miserably. Ashamed of remaining uncommitted, looking away from Chancefort, the yellow buttercup mocked his downcast eyes. I actually came to tell you that the medical council is still in session, Chancefort said, his voice a shade warmer than urbane. The arch-brother Inhalt Uat, our director, is there. If you would care to speak to him. I suppose I'd better. Stop shaking, you old fool, Dobby told himself, but he could not stop. As soon as he denied Israel, he knew he believed in him and all he stood for. He knew further that nobody else believed, so it was up to him, Darby, whether Israel was released from what might be a life's confinement. Larger issues, too, might depend on his efforts, for through Israel lay the way to bright, friendly worlds far beyond the sun's unwelcoming cluster of planets. All he had to do was convince a board of experts who had apparently already made up their minds on the subject of Israel's sanity that they were wrong. That was all, but it would not be easy. Can I see Israel first? Davy asked. You forced me to answer that question as I answered it before. It was a negative, Chancefort replied. Now, if you will come with me, I think the council will see you. They walked down the corridor to an elevator, went up one deck to a more grandly appointed part of the ship, and so into a fur-lined boardroom. Thick curtains had been drawn here, a fire burned, and on one wall hung an original Wadafango, an anatomical drawing of a tiger. A long table stood in the middle of the room, soft chairs arranged its walls, but the 4 men present stood stretching their legs by the fire. As the round of introductions disclosed, Arch-brother Inald Uat was a small, stocky man with a bald head, clothed from neck to foot in tight blue flannel, his manner reserved, his voice dry. He shook hands with Darby, crossing to the table to get a bundle of notes secured by a plain silver clasp. This is a very interesting case for us, Mr. Dale, he remarked conversationally. It's more than a case to me, sir, Darby said. Yes, of course. You and he became very friendly in the brief time you were together, I understand. Be warned, though, against letting the matter become an obsession. It's not becoming an obsession, Darby said. I take Israel's part, sir, because there is nobody else to take it. I feel it would be easy for him to be victimized. The whole thing seemed pretty simple once, but since he's been up here at New Union in your hands, it seems to have got more and more complicated. He was aware as he spoke of sounding less courteous than he had intended. He was confused. The boardroom confused him. The rather unrestrained members of the council confused him. They differed so greatly from the people of his home hills. Although in his own sphere of dairy farming and stock breeding, Darby was well known and respected here. He felt out of his depth, too conscious of seeming the simple countryman among the experts, aware his tunic colour was hot as theirs. A horrible feeling seized him that he was about to appear foolish, and from then on it never left him. It got between him and his reason, forcing him to say always the wrong thing. I mean, this business is just a question of common sense, he added, making things worse instead of better. Inalduat smiled kindly as if covering his own embarrassment. There are problems, unfortunately, he said, where common sense is too blunt a tool to work with. Mr. Dale and Israel's problem is one such. Indeed, we have achieved results only by trying several oblique approaches, as you shall hear. I was just offering my opinion, Davy said. He intended to sound penitent, humble even, but it sounded to find in the preferred room Quite so, Inaltuat said, quietly, inspecting his fingers as if for the first time. Believe me, we do realize what a fascinating and gaudy specimen Israel must have seemed in Bagawa, but here on the Cyber Queen, we may be rather more inured to odd fish. Alas, we aren't all simpletons in Bagawa, Darby exclaimed, nettled by what he interpreted as a slur on his native country. Yuat inclined his head sadly, acknowledging the truth of the remark. Realizing he was again on the verge of making a fool of himself, Davy tugged at his tunic and said in an explanatory fashion, "In fact, I'm sorry to have to come all this way to bother you, sir, but I felt I had to see what you were doing about Israel. I mean, if you were doing anything." "We have been doing quite a lot," Uat said lightly. "It is good of you to come. All of us here will be delighted to assure you that Israel has occupied much of our attention in the past weeks." He shook his head and smiled, and the other men also smiled. They had a long, trying meeting, and now this. Huat attempted to give Davy a chance, but Davy caught the note of reproach in the director's voice and flushed heavily, feeling like a small boy brought before a teacher. "How should I know what you were doing here?" he muttered. "I felt it was my duty to come and see." A gleam of irritation showed in Huat's eyes and disappeared. Brother Chancellor, knowing his superior, feared for the worst. The director was not a forgiving man once he conceived a dislike for someone. From then on, Davy was at a disadvantage. Instead of becoming a discussion, their meeting crystallized into a muted clash of personalities. Its outcome already predictable. Sensing something of this, Davy tried to wrench the conversation back into another channel. "I believe Israel to be sane," he exclaimed. He could see immediately that his bluntness made them more withdrawn. For them, he was now the stupid layman unable to evaluate evidence. "I was just going to run through a few notes for your benefit," Huat said, rustling his papers. "But they will explain our findings on the patient, and I sincerely hope clear your mind of any anxieties or uncertainties you may have." "Tell him about the specialists," Inal, Chancellor said in an aside. Yes, the Archmother said. "These notes are extracts from the reports of specialists from this and other health ships who have examined Israel, as he calls himself, during the course of the last month. Sit down, Mr. Dale, sit down and unbutton." Davy hesitated, then sat formally unbuttoning his tunic. The three members of the council who had not spoken seemed to take this as a cue to disappear. "Now," Huat said, clearing his throat. He peered at the papers before him. "First, let's get our facts straight, maybe. Israel was discovered sheltering in a barn on the evening of 5 months 31st last night by one George Fancy, a bondsman on Brundel's farm in the province of Bagara. He was naked and dazed and seemed at that time unable to speak at all. Fancy wrapped sacks around him and took him to his own caravan. By morning Israel was better, although his memory seemed clouded. He then spoke our tongue perfectly, an important point, Mr. Dale, which alone throws grave doubt on his galactic origins." "But he explained," Davy began. "Oh yes, he explained everything, Mr. Dale, but let us continue the summary. Israel stayed in Fancy's caravan till the next morning, the 33rd of Phi, when Fancy decided to take him to Brundle. Brundle kept him for 3 days, in which time he got you and Ostrakhan, the local tributary doctor, to question him. The province police were also brought in to try and trace Israel's whereabouts before Fancy had found him, but so far nothing has come to light." "A point for Israel," Davy said. "A small point for Israel," Huat conceded. "And that's about it. You alone seem to have placed much credence in the man's tale. And knowing of my friend Chancellor here, through mutual acquaintances, you decided to bring Israel up to us. A wise step, if I may be permitted to say so." "I did it for Israel's sake," Davy said. He was deeply disturbed to find that nobody believed him. I could see he would soon begin to question his own sanity. He had just gone through a period of great strain, as you know. When I heard that the Cyber Queen was off the coast, naturally I got in touch. I wanted you to prove to him he was sane. You would have been powerful allies for him." With a little dry crumb of sound, Inalduat cleared his throat. continuing his account as if he had not heard Davy. For the past 32 days, he said, Israel has been here on shipboard. He has been thoroughly examined from every possible viewpoint. The first thing was naturally a physiological check. It revealed nothing at all abnormal in the patient's makeup, no bones out of place, not a spare ounce of cartilage, no extra lungs, and not even, he allowed himself a modicum of amusement, a concealed tentacle. In every respect, Israel is a physically normal man, born here on Earth, destined to die here on Earth. I think we might have indeed expected some trifling irregularity, if he had been, as he claims to be, a specimen of galactic life. Why, Davy asked hotly, can't evolution run the same course on two planets? He has a point there, Inald, Transformer murmured. A point we did not overlook, the Archbrother agreed, which brings me to the next step in our investigation. We were, you see, impressed enough with the lack of logical flaws in Israel's arguments to take a good deal of trouble in checking them. I personally called up the astronomer extraordinary and asked him about life on other planets. He paused impressively. Davy just waited. The astronomer extraordinary, he once said, told me that the possibility of life on other worlds, apart perhaps from a few lowly fungi on Mars, is entirely unproved. Furthermore, he cautioned me that direct evidence of the existence of planetary systems other than our own is not yet forthcoming. He said that according to various ancient records, spaceships have been launched from Earth for other systems from time to time. There was no record of any of them having returned, and he finished by assuring me that space travel has no future. Davy could restrain himself no longer. He jumped up. You call that taking trouble? He exclaimed. Heavens above! Who am I to argue with the astronomer extraordinary, but what does he know about it? He's no expert on space travel. Agreed, said Duat, his voice a few degrees cooler. There were no experts on space travel, just a few speculative companies who have set their paltry igloos on the moon, hoping to find minerals or such. Speculation. There I suggest you have the whole business in one word. Do please sit down again, Mr. Dale. Sitting was the last thing Davy felt like doing. He tried to appeal silently for help to Transfor, but the latter was gazing into the fire. With a bad grace, Davy plunked himself down on the chair. Go on, he said testily. What's your next point? Before speaking again, Ruat clearly speculated upon whether the effort would be worthwhile. We now came to Israel with the next tests, he said at last. I refer to the psychological ones, and that is a field in which I give you my word there are experts. We, if I may say so, without transgressing the bounds of modesty, we are the experts in this ship. For our consideration, we had an unlikely document, the statement of Israel, elicited from him in numerous interviews. In brief, it relates the facts of Israel's life, how he grew up, became what we would call an admiral in the interpenetrator fleets, to use his own extraordinary phrase, was defeated in some sort of battle, and finally landed on Earth stark naked and without a goatre to bless himself with. I'm not going to waste your time, Mr. Dale, or my own, in embarking on a detailed description of that fantastic farrago of autobiography, transcribed from Gel and divided into subjects. It fills 5 fat volumes. You will see we have been thorough. It contains, however, 1 or 2 cardinal points on which the one diagnosis of Israel rests, and these I'll bring to your attention. You may find their perfervid inventiveness more attractive than I do. Just a minute, Davy said. You're telling me this, and I can see from every word you say your mind shut tighter than a Hobie oyster. Was it like that before Israel came to you? Because, if so, the poor devil didn't stand a candle's chance in hell of proving his case. You're talking with your tunic buttoned, Transfor protested sharply. That sort of stuff will get you nowhere. Try and... We're getting nowhere as it is, Davy snapped. I'm a countryman, and I like plain speaking. Transfor, Duat said, folding his hands and turning wearily to his colleague. I suspect I may be unable to talk plainly enough for our country friend. Perhaps you will take over the explanations for a little while. Certainly, Chancellor said. Perhaps you'd like me to pour us all some drinks light first. Capital idea, the director said, softening. I believe they are concealed in that rather ornate cupboard over there. As Chancellor crossed the room, Inalduat said to Davy more humanely, You know, Dial, we believe ourselves to be, in effect, doing you a favour in explaining all this to you. We are by no means obliged to explain. By the law, Ishmael is now a subject of medical hierarchy. You are not in any way related to Ishmael. We merely were somewhat touched by your loyalty to a very unfortunate case. I'll endeavour to feel obliged to you when I've heard the rest of what you have to say, Davai said grimly. What are these cardinal points you mentioned? A distilled vintage was handed around, and scented sweets. Chancellor sat down by the fire, putting his thin hands out to the flames. You'll probably know, he began quietly, that however elaborate the circumstantially the imaginings of a neurotic person are, they reveal certain basic emotions such as fear, love, lust for power. Looking beyond the symbols that a disordered mind uses to camouflage these emotions from itself, we can generally see the emotive impulses quite clearly. In this respect, Israel differs not at all from any case we have ever handled, except that his imaginings reach the peak of inventiveness. Note several points. This impressive civilization to which Israel claims to belong spreads across 10,000 planets and 5 times as many light years, or maybe 15,000 planets and 10 times as many light years. Ishmael doesn't remember. Would you remember, Davy asked? Tell me how many towns there are on Earth. That is not the point I'm making, Chancellor said. I'm trying to show you how Israel strove to build up a pattern of complexity in his make-believe world. The war that he claims is being waged is also amazingly complicated, like enlarged 3D chess with obscure motivations and strict rules of chivalry. Israel seeks refuge behind this confusion, endeavoring to lose himself. But a galactic civilization would be complicated, Davy World. Why can't you just take it that he's telling the truth? He's got no motive for lying. His motive is the usual one in such cases, Chancellor said. That is, as complete an escape from reality as possible. He cannot be telling the truth because what he says is too fantastic for a sane man to believe. And also, you will notice that he has cleverly picked on a story which does not involve him in the awkward necessity of producing one shred of tangible proof. Davy sunk his head into his hands. You go around in circles, he said. He told you why he arrived naked without any possessions. That's just what I'm complaining about, Chancellor said. Israel can explain everything. The interpenetrators that brought him here came silently and left silently and were invisible. We've not got a thing. No sight of ships, no telltale landing marks in the field, no scraps of cloth of an alien weave, no rings made of strange alloys, not even an Aldebaran cornplaster on his foot. Nothing. Only his wild and unsupported story. Not a shred of external evidence anywhere. And if you had anything, you'd explain it away, Davy said. Well, we'll continue with the next point, Chancellor said, raising an aggrieved eyebrow at the arch-brother, who nodded sympathetically. Notice that Israel joined the interpenetration fleets and worked his way up to the rank of admiral. Well, megalomania, and we shall find it recurs over and over again. Here it masquerades under the flaring sun of an admiral's insignia. Yes, he even drew the insignia for us. He couldn't be a ranker, couldn't he, or a bondsman, or whatever They have. He had to be an admiral in a mighty space fleet. Such self-aggrandizement is a common feature of insanity. Davy was silent, avoiding the challenge in the other's voice. He felt his assurance fading and longed to speak to Israel again, to feel reinvigorated by that unquenchable nature. If these devils would only see it, a man like Israel could be nothing less than admiral. The next point, Transfor continued, is even more damning. You'll remember that Israel claims to have been captured during the preposterous war by the enemy. They vanquished him, and did Israel happen to tell you the name of the race that vanquished him? It was Israel. Israel was conquered by Israel. What of it? Davy asked stupidly. This was too much for Inaldwat. He leaned forward, glass in hand, his jaws almost snapping. What of it, you dare ask? He said, if you are attempting to insult us with stupidity, we may as well consider this talk closed. Israel is suffering, to couch the matter in terms you might comprehend, from split personality. He is himself. He is also his own worst enemy, Israel. Against Israel, a man divided against himself. It's obvious even to a layman. Not at all, Davy said, trying to check his anger. Well, it confounded well should be. Not at all, Davy bellowed. Good God, Begara fought the Gorags in the last war. One of our bravest men was a field captain Gorag, but we didn't lock him in the nearest button-biter's barge just because of his unfortunate name. There was an icy silence. I believe, Watt said, that the disgusting term for mental health trips that you employed has ceased to be polite usage even in the low comedy halls. You cannot dismiss everything as coincidence, Mr. Dale, Chancellor said hurriedly, waving his hands as if to hush his superior. You must try to regard this from the viewpoint of mind healing. We do not believe in coincidence. Let me proceed to the next and last point on which the crux of the matter may be said to rest. The etiquette of this incredible galactic squabble, Israel claims, renders an admiral or a similar large fry liable to exile for life if he is captured by the enemy. As you might expect in this case, the exiling itself is a complicated business, a mixture of leniency and harshness. The exile concerned, by which we mean Israel, has his name struck off the rolls of civilization and is left on a planet absolutely bare-handed and bare-backed. Before he is landed, he is taught by hypnotic means to be fluent in the language of the planet or country to which he is banished, which neatly absolves Israel from the difficulty of having to pretend to speak a strange tongue. You make him sound such a liar, Davy said bitterly. No, Chancellor contradicted. That is a basic misconception. We are convinced he genuinely believes all he says. But remember, and this is another loophole for him, he cannot speak the galactic tongue because that was erased when his enemies forced our language down his throat. Damning though that is, it is the lesser half of the exile edict. It was stipulated, according to Israel, that exiles should be landed only on planets outside the Galactic Federation, planets too primitive to have developed more than the rudiments of what he calls mechanical space travel. There they have to have survived among hostile natives as best they can. In other words, Begara and Earth is Israel's galactic idea of hell. Just why do you find that so damning? Davy asked. Why? Because it is all too plainly the fabrication of a guilty mind trying to punish itself by inflicting eternal suffering on itself. It is a punishment pattern we meet with here time after time. Before Davy could recover himself sufficiently to answer, Rawat got to his feet, smoothed an imaginary hair over his bald head, and spoke. So, there you have the Israel case, Dial, he said. He is a sick creature, haunted by the spectre of persecution. I trust you appreciate, though I fear you don't, the great pains we have been to in this matter, and the neat way in which we have tied up all the loose ends. Plausible though Israel is, Sansfor said, also standing and buttoning his tunic to conclude the meeting, he is clearly revealed as hopelessly, even dangerously unbalanced. Quite candidly, there's hardly a disorder in the MOOC that isn't present in greater or lesser degree, and we've not unravelled them all yet. This sort of thing takes time and patience. Give the police a little longer to trace him, the arch-brother said with relish, and we shall probably find he's a common murderer with amnesia actuated by guilt. Oh, Israel, you're a common murderer. The hostile natives have indeed got you in their nets. You should have come 50 million years ago. The Neanderthals would have shown more understanding, more mercy. And Harry screwed his eyes up and raised his fist slowly before his face. Blood swam and roared in his veins like a waterfall. For a moment he thought of throwing himself at Inald Wat. Then hopelessness dropped neatly over him. He lowered his hands. I must see Israel, he said dully. That will not be possible, Wat said. We have had to remove him to a quieter place. He threatened to get violent. Do you wonder, Davy said. With stiff, formal fingers he buttoned his tunic. The arch-brother and Chancellor remained side by the fire, waiting politely for him to leave. Davy stood defeated before them, the only man to believe in Israel, rocking unintelligently from one foot to another, his jaw slack. At last he sighed. Turning to leave without a word of thanks, he caught sight of the tired buttercup pinned to his chest. How it must have amused these people. Yet Davy felt obscurely that it was a slender link with sanity and the galaxy. Suddenly he saw the planned cruelty of Israel's exile, the bitterness of being among a people without understanding. I'm going to call the new union News Gels to see if they will help me, he said resolutely. Excellent idea. Emotionalism and sensationalism are just their meat, the arch-brother replied, but Davy had gone. Finding his way blindly down the gangplank, he headed for the city. A cold wind met him, and he recalled that he had left his fur cloak somewhere in the ship. Now it was too late to return for it. Overhead, through thinning cloud, galactic stars shone with terrible urgency.